Hello, everybody. Hi, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is Left Bank Book Presents the debut author from Kat Tang, 5-Star Stranger. Kat will be in conversation tonight with Ruth Kim, who is the volunteer ambassador for the Very Asian Foundation here in St. Louis. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. So a couple of notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. So when you shop at Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it helps to pave the streets and keep our parks amazing, and of course keep our lights on as well. So thank you so much for shopping local and supporting us for this event. We also want to extend an audience welcome for our virtual audience. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. You'll be able to participate in the Q&A at the end of our event tonight by leaving your question as a YouTube comment. So thank you so much for being here. We at Left Bank are always working hard to plan new events for readers of all ages. Of note, on August 20th, so next week, we've got the brilliant P. Jelly Clark, who will be here to discuss his new novel, The Dead Cattail Assassins, which is set in a brand new world and fantastical city full of gods and assassins. He's an amazing author of Master of Jin, Ring Shout, a couple other ones. So if you're a fantasy lover or just a fan of great books, join us then. Full event calendar can be found at left-bank.com. So there's something for everybody, like I said, check us out there. And now for tonight's event. Kat Tang is a graduate of Columbia's MFA program, where she taught as an undergraduate writing fellow. Born in China, relocated to Japan, and raised in California, she's fascinated by how we make and fake human connection in a technologically evolving world. Her short stories and graphic narratives have appeared in Electric Literature, The Margins, Pigeon Pages, and elsewhere. Her new book is the exciting and resonant debut 5-Star Stranger, which follows the story of a rental stranger, a companion hired under various guises, who walk the line between professional and personal in many surprising ways. 5-Star Stranger is a strikingly vivid novel about the commodification of relationships in a gig economy, isolation in a hyper-connected world, and the risk of asking for what we want from those who cannot give. This is the story of a man who finds out who he is by being anyone but himself. According to Huffington Post, Kat Tang's inventive debut novel perfectly captures what it feels like to be lonely and searching for human connection in our modern world of parasocial relationships and contractual experiences. And like I said at the beginning, Kat will be joining us in conversation with Ruth Kim. Kim is a volunteer ambassador for the Very Asian Foundation, which is a 501c3 that shines a light on Asian experiences through advocacy and celebration. So here to tell us a little bit more about that, please join me in welcoming Ruth.
First, I just got back from 2 glorious weeks in the Southwest and came to St. Louis with a high mold count, and the airplane felt like a bucket of germs. So I don't want to give Kat anything, so I'm masking up, and I hope you don't mind. Second, I recently retired from 40 years of being a corporate lawyer. So this is my afterlife, and it is a dream. Yeah, did you want to do a selfie like you usually do?
Yeah. Let's
So we're first going to do a selfie, and then we'll jump into questions.
Yeah, so everyone will be in this selfie. I want to get the cat in the selfie. Hey, kitty, you want to get a selfie? All right, maybe we can talk about photos on what side? Yeah,
That's great. Thank you, honey.
And if Miss House, you would look at the camera. Sorry.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm so honored today to be here in conversation with our very special guest, Kat Tang. She's the gifted author of her already highly acclaimed book, 5-Star Stranger, which just came out this month. So an author and favorite that I had the honor of hearing speak here at Left Bank Books, Gary Shteyngart, notes a hilarious and touching meditation on our atomized age. It's rare for a book so profound to give so much pleasure page by page. There are other very resonant comments in the liner of the book, and you should read every single one of them. They further entice you and beguile you. Some of them say 5-star stranger is a 5-star read. Kat Tang writes with care and clarity, perception, and perfect comedic timing. Sly, sophisticated, and compulsively readable debut. A genuine original, a dissembling, propulsive, and absorbing read. 5-star stranger carries its comedic premise to surprising and intriguing places. This is a wise, funny, and affecting novel, and for Kat Tang, a memorable debut, says Sam Lipside on their blog. So it's such an engaging and unexpected take on relationships in our tech-reliant age. And I'm eager to ask you so many questions about this book, but before I do, I'd like us to get to know you better. And y'all, I'm cheating a little with notes because I'm still on vacation brain. Excuse that. So Kat, you were born in China, raised in Japan, relocated to California. What can you tell us about your growing up and the impact and effect it had on your writing and your view of the world?
Yeah, so it's kind of loud. So I moved a lot as a child. Even when I ended up in California, I moved every 2 to 3 years. I think it really allowed me to understand or think more about how we form friendships, how we form relationships, because from a young age, I had to do so sort of over and over and over again. And so I think that's something that comes out in the novel, which is, what is a genuine relationship? How do they form? And if we just go through the steps of one, is it real or is it not real? And how do we define that? But in terms of my own background, I think it gave me, I became interested in language because I started off, speaking Chinese, and then I learned Japanese, and then I learned English. And so just the way we communicate with each other through different languages. My mom would tell me this funny story of when I first moved from Japan back to China for a little bit. Whenever I was arguing with other children in Chinese, if I started to lose, I would start speaking to them in Japanese instead so that I could win the argument because they wouldn't know what I was saying.
It's a pretty great skill. I don't know that many of us can do that.
I can't do it anymore. I've lost all my Japanese.
So, is there a particular childhood memory, in addition to that brings you joy, that you think about and you consistently recall with great happiness?
I think I had a pretty happy childhood, maybe unlike a lot of authors. So there's a lot of good memories. I guess one in particular that I can think of right now was my 10th birthday party. I really enjoyed that. A lot of friends. People gave me a lot of cute Sanrio trinkets and like gumball machines. One of the girls stole a couple of my presents. So I also remember, with every happy side, you remember the pain as well. So yeah, that was my, traumatic childhood incident.
Do you have siblings?
I do.
And where are you in the birth order?
I'm actually the oldest by quite a lot. My brother is 8 years younger than me, and my sister is 12 years younger than me. So I sort of had the experience of raising them a little bit when I was 12 years old and in high school.
So do you have thoughts about how your place in the birth order and in your family and childhood relationships inform or influence your writing? Either in content or style?
Yeah, I think because I was an only child for a while, I was really bored all the time. And so I used my imagination a lot. There's a line in here towards the end about the narrator and how he imagines, fighting little battles or like being like Mario on like the buildings and things like that. And I think those types of ideas came from a childhood where I wasn't allowed to watch TV. I mostly just read a lot, but I just had to entertain myself because I didn't have siblings until I was much older.
And did you enjoy writing as a child?
I tried. I was actually more of a visual, like I drew a lot more than I wrote. I did write for fun, and I wrote this crazy story in the 6th grade that was like about 9/11, but also time travel, and like this girl travels back in time to like save her dad, and during the eclipse, it was quite wild, but it actually won like some regional award or something.
That's pretty remarkable.
That was the start of my writing career.
Where were you living?
I was in San Jose, so I didn't even know what New York was.
Uh-huh.
I had just heard about it on the news. So
Oh, interesting.
yeah.
I think that imaginative and creative brain is something that some of us don't have as strongly, so we really appreciate it. Similarly, how does your cross-cultural relationships and your, cross-cultural travels and your perception of your place in the world, your perception of your place culturally affect or inform your writing, either content-wise or writing style?
Yeah, I travel quite a lot. I really enjoy traveling. I think that one of the reasons why is because it allows us to look at people from or learn from people from other cultures, other backgrounds, other languages, and sort of see what is a universally human experience and, learn about why, or reflect back on what we do as a society, as Americans, like why is it that we do things this way when in Spain they do things this other way, right? And so kind of analyzing that, looking at that, has always been an interest of mine. I studied cultural anthropology in college, just the study of people, of cultures, and I think that really shows up in my writing through the way that the narrator will sort of point out, like, why is it that we do X, Y, and Z as a society, like he's kind of analyzing these little turns and not just taking them for granted that we should do things the way that we are expected to.
So with all of your travels and all of your perceptions of different cultures, as you travel, did you always feel like you were fit or in place or in the right place? Because I grew up born and raised in the Midwest. And for the longest time, and then I went to Amherst College, which was an all-white male school in the first class of women. And so I continually felt like a tourist in my own life. I continually felt like trying to find my fit. Did traveling a lot make you always fit or make you always feel a little bit out of fit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I had the opposite experience weirdly growing up. I grew up in Cupertino in San Jose, where being Asian American was the norm, which is not really, the usual experience for Asian Americans in the US. We were predominantly, Chinese or Vietnamese or, so it was, so when I was growing up, I was like the majority actually. And then when I traveled, and then also when I went to college, I was not the majority. But when I travel, I like being a little bit out of place. And I think maybe that comes from having moved so much as a child, always being a little bit uncomfortable in my situation so that I can learn and grow instead of feeling like the days are just passing by and I'm not learning anything new and I'm not paying attention really to what's going on in my day-to-day.
It's so unusual to be in the visible majority. When I grew up, we moved around a lot when we were little kids, but mostly in St. Louis in the Ladue School District, which at the time was predominantly Jewish. And so I thought the whole world was Jewish. And I went to Amherst College and I was sitting with my roommates who were great-great-granddaughters of people on the Mayflower. And I said to them, "Isn't this the weirdest little enclave?" And they said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, there weren't no Jewish people here." And they looked at me like I had fallen off another planet. And I said, they looked at me and they said, "Why would you say that?" And I said, "Because the majority of the world is Jewish." And I had a reckoning there. I didn't realize that. So I was I felt very much like some creature with two heads trying to put on a sweater, and I couldn't find the right head on. But I sort of came into my own eventually. And I kind of like that journey of feeling a little out of step and being very aware of it. And so it makes you figure out, how you move through society and your place in society. So I know that you attended Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen? How did you go there? And what were you planning to do when you went there? And were your parents tiger parents?
No, actually they weren't really. My parents they pushed me for sure. They were like, when I was a child, if I got less than a 95 on a test, I would cry. And so one time I got an 88 and I was devastated. I was like, oh my gosh, 88, I'm never going to go to college. And it turned out to be fine. I worked hard. I was in every single club, did all the things. And then,
Did you know you were going to go to Harvard?
No, not at all.
Apply to Harvard?
I feel like these types of schools, when you apply, it's such a crapshoot, you just have no idea. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get into, Harvard at all. So it was really like out on a limb that I applied. And I was could not believe that I got in, but yeah, I really loved the experience.
So when you went, did you go with an idea of what you were gonna study?
Yeah, so I thought I was gonna be a lawyer. I went in and wanted to do like pre-law, and then they said, there is no pre-law here. And I said, okay, great, new plan. So I started to study government, did not like that, found out about cultural anthropology. I did a minor in art. And then when I left, I ended up doing this like volunteer fellowship in Japan for a year, and then applied. Actually, when I was in university, I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. So I tried consulting, I tried all these other things. But then when I left, I was like, oh, okay, back to being a lawyer. So then I applied to law school.
So then you actually went
Yeah,
to law school.
and then I became a lawyer.
And so where did you go to law school?
I went to Berkeley, UC
So you
Berkeley.
went back to California?
Yes.
And then what kind of law did you study?
I was a white collar litigator.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I did that
For how many
for
years?
only for 3 years. I only lasted 3 years.
And what made you change?
So I became a lawyer because I wanted to do human rights work predominantly, but I needed to pay off my loans, and so I ended up at a big law firm, and I, worked in asylum. I worked with, a lot of pro bono work, but it was just so draining, and I didn't really feel like this was the best use of my skills. And I was not a great lawyer. I just want to put that out there. I was like, okay, so, A, B, typical, it's like A, therefore B, therefore C, therefore D. I'd be like, A, therefore D, because subtext. Like, what about the subtext? And the partner's like, no, no subtext, just lay everything out.
So a lot hasn't changed in law, because I went to law school decades before you. I, however, was not as altruistic and visionary as you were. I went because, I thought about medical school, didn't love it. Thought about business school, didn't love it. Thought about graduate school, didn't love it. Took a year as a paralegal, and I thought I could do this, so I went to law school. And back then, it was pretty brutal in terms of mostly men. And I would have people say, like, a male partner literally said to me, are you in the practice of law because you want to be a lawyer, because you want to be a husband?
Oh.
And at that point, I had had so much of it that I looked at him and I said, well, if they're all like you, then no. And I would go home regularly to my mom and cry and say that, this is so hard, it's so hard, and this is so not fun. And she said, don't worry, honey, they're going to hell. So that was my cure, and that was how I got through. But I gritted through and stuck with it, and I found a lot of it was that feeling of being an imposter. And I actually finally got over that, and that's what made it okay. And then you find that you can do other things with life. But you didn't stay in the practice of law, which many of us lawyers are envious of and fantasize about. So tell.
Yeah, it's funny, during the California event, a lot of my law school friends from Berkeley were in the audience, and I was asked a question about law school, and I looked to my friends and was like, how many of you guys stayed as lawyers? And they were like, sadly, all of us. So yeah, it's not something, it's a lot of investment, it's a lot of time, it's difficult to leave. My sister asked me when I left the law if I hated money, because, why else would I leave to be a writer? But I just found that I felt like the work that I was doing, someone else could do. I didn't feel like I was making an impact or a difference or anything that I wanted, really. And I was looking for creative outlets all the time. I took this after work class at NYU, an advanced writing workshop. I'd never done a workshop before. I'd never taken a creative writing class, but I was writing stories in my free time after work. So I thought, well, why not, get somebody's eyes on it and let me know if they're any good. So I did that workshop, and from that, I got a writing sample with which to apply to an MFA. And somehow, even though my professor from that writing workshop told me, well, I don't think you know what a short story is. So I don't think you're going to get into any big programs. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. I'm still not sure I know what a short story is to this day. They're so mysterious, but wonderful. And yeah, I got into Columbia somehow. So thank goodness that worked out.
So you quit the practice of law totally and went to a full-time program.
Full time.
And
Yeah.
how long did that last? And
It was 3 years. Yeah, and it was during COVID actually. So we started in 2019, and then after one semester, COVID hit, and we were all just virtual, which for writing was okay, but I felt so bad for the people in like visual art or theater or, you know, anything else. It was a really rough time.
That is so stunning. That is so recent. And the fact that so quickly you have a book that is highly lauded. Because we hear stories and when we talk to other authors and hear that they have, you know, taken years to write their first book that was rejected 65 times, and then they try again, and then they finally get a book, and then they get on the bestseller list, etc. So that's pretty remarkable. I would love to ask you to read a passage from this book, but before we do that, for the guests who haven't yet read the book, and I think there probably are only a very few, without giving away any major surprises, and there were major surprises in this book, how do you like to describe the story to people, to tell them about what is happening?
Yeah, so the like kind of quick elevator pitch is that this is a novel about a man who rents himself on this app to play the role of whatever you need. It could be a mourner at a funeral, it could be a best man at a wedding, you know, and on this app there's many, many different people and they all have different ratings. He's one of the highest rated, hence 5-star Shteyngart. And the main storyline is about how he's being hired to be a father to a young girl who doesn't know that he's not her real dad. And as she's starting to get a little bit older, she's recognizing that there's something off about this relationship between her mother and, you know, so-called father, and she's not really sure what's going on.
Okay, so do you want to read a passage? I
Yeah.
think it's always really magical to hear the writer read their words in their own voice. So could you do that for us?
Yeah, so I'm just a word of warning, this is kind of an intense passage. There is like suicide within it, it's a little bit intense. But I also wanted to note that there's a little Easter egg. I got to design this print on the inside, and it's a mouse in a cup. And I was trying to decide between either the mouse in the cup or a shark, and after you hear this passage, you'll know why.
This is intense.
This is intense, yeah. So be warned, okay.
But I want to say that there is very much in this book that is screamingly funny too, so.
I think this mixes it somewhat.
Okay. Go for it.
Yeah, hopefully this won't scare you guys off, okay. I'm in love, I said to my mother, stupidly, without thinking. At the time, I was pretty sure I was in love. The requisite butterflies in my stomach were working overtime. I could pick her voice out in a crowded auditorium, and I could sense without looking when she was within a 50-foot radius of me. I want to ask her to prom, so I need a suit. Oh, by the way, this is him reminiscing on his childhood and a conversation he's having with his mother. So he's like 17 years old. My mother said nothing in response to my outburst, placing the dishes in the sink and pulling on her yellow rubber gloves. Mom! She began washing the bowls. Oftentimes, my mother preferred to be left alone with her thoughts. She signaled this by acting as though I weren't there. I figured this might have been one of those times, but I was beginning to tire of always following her moods, wants, and whims. Irritation ripping through me, I pushed my chair out and it skipped on the linoleum. Without turning around, my mother spoke. Let's say the three of us were scuba diving in the ocean, she said. You, me, and this person you think you love. We're swimming in murky waters. Suddenly, a shark appears. You are the only one with a knife. Who would you stab and leave as bait so that the other person could get away? Taken aback, I watched my mother's narrow shoulder blades move like vestigial wings beneath her t-shirt as she scrubbed. I'd stab the shark? You can't do that, she said, turning to face me as the plate in her hand drip suds to the floor. You have to choose. Who would you stab? My mother, with that drawn-on mark on her cheek watching me, waiting for an answer. Could she see it, the answer in my heart? Her, I guess, I said. Well then, said my mother, maybe you're not in love after all. It was an unnerving conversation. I never ended up asking the girl to prom. How could I? I didn't have the costume or the conviction necessary to play the part. Sometimes I wondered if I had answered my mother's question truthfully, whether she'd noticed a wavering. Was that the real reason why we left California? Because whatever big break she thought was coming in New York never came. Looking back now, there isn't anyone I wouldn't kill in order to save my mother, to see her again, to ask her how and where and why she got the gun. Had I made her so desperately unhappy in New York that there was no other choice but to wrap her hands around a weapon not just sufficient to kill, but almost guaranteed when used at close range to cause injury so irreversible that it doesn't give her child who opened the door to a darkened, even a splinter of a chance to try and staunch the bleeding, and then fumble with a phone that won't open with his fingerprint because his fingers are slick with blood until finally he manages to press and hold down the emergency call button just to answer a series of inane questions about whether the victim is male or female and how many people in that. And please describe in detail what is happening, because by then, the je ne sais the fuck quoi of what makes a human alive is undoubtedly gone from the body still clutching the gun, which fired a bullet that traveled at twice the speed of sound, meaning that she probably didn't even hear the gunshot that ended her life, but she knew before her existence flickered out that she wanted everything to be over, while you, who she left behind, had no idea she wanted everything to be over until you saw the hole in her chest, and now you can never ask why. And you'll never hear her say your name again. One last story. My mother and I witnessed our first snowfall in New York City, not long after she dragged a raging teenager across the country. She'd been so enchanted by the flurries that she rushed outside, and I, determined to do the opposite of her, stayed indoors. My back turned to the windows, refusing to acknowledge the swirling eddies of white. Later, as I cleaned out our fridge after her suicide, I discovered that she had collected several cups of snow to stow in the freezer. And one of them was a frozen mouse. Its forepaws in front of its face, eyes wide open, and fingers splayed as though shielding itself from disaster. By then, the snow had become solid chunks of ice, with no memory of soft and delicate flakes.
So very, very much. When I first heard it was about a mental stranger, I thought it was going to be sort of a rom-com, and I was a little bit concerned. But I found the book to be unbelievably absorbing and very, very moving. And despite the premise of artifice that was inherent in his role, I think the book resonates with such authenticity, and the relationships seem so true and genuine. So for the 2.5 days that I binge read this book on my holiday, I kept it very close at hand because I really was surprised at the twists and the turns that it took. Why did you, as a female writer, choose to tell the story from the perspective of a male protagonist?
Yeah, so even though the protagonist is a man, I think that a lot of the story is about the women who are around him, or that are on his mind, like his mother. And it was interesting because I think also for this type of role, if it was a female protagonist, it would be a little trickier because people would think automatically of escorts or, some sort of, something like maybe it would be more dangerous for a woman to be rented out. So when I chose for it to be a male character, I found that I was somewhat freed of these concerns and about having to write about womanhood, which is something I think about all the time. And my next novel is from the perspective of a woman. I don't have an issue with that. It's just, it was so wild. It gave me almost like a glimpse of maybe what it's like to be a man in society. I didn't have to think about those things even as I was writing a male character.
But to me, the thing that surprised me was that it resonated realistically to me. So the relationship between him and his pretend daughter was it just gripped my heart. And where that goes and how that evolves will leave you a little bit breathless. It is beautiful and it's sad, but it's authentic. So I was curious how you developed the voice of your characters, like Lily, the amazing little girl, who was so smart, and she's not at all canned or predictable. And Darlene is one of his customers or clients, Laurie, Lily's mom, and the old stranger.
Yeah. I really enjoy writing children, actually. So before this novel, I actually had, I don't want to call it failed, it just never went anywhere. I wasn't able to get an agent for it, but I had a short story collection, and it was all about these children in an apartment complex in San Jose, California. And I loved writing these children's voices because I think in general, children are so observant and maybe they don't have yet the language for what they're seeing and how to describe what they're, how to fully process what they're seeing, but they understand inherently when something's a little off or, not quite right. And so Lily's voice came very naturally to me. I think I'm still a child at heart maybe, so I could just really channel that. And then Darlene is a writer, and so I was able to channel the frustrations of being a writer when I was writing Darlene's character. And everyone else, it just took many drafts actually. So originally, the book was structured totally differently. Lily and Mari's section was just a fourth, and everyone else that I was writing about had kind of equal amounts, like AJ, the aging finance bro, had a larger part to play in this novel. And so when I condensed it, I was able to condense also, like distill his voice so that the section that features him, you really get to know who he is like right away.
It's really remarkable because when you read these characters, while they pass somewhat in and out quickly from chapter to chapter, you get a real sense of who they are. And for example, Lily, who was super intuitive, I thought the portrayal of her was beautiful, and yet it was almost painful to read because one of the observations she writes about her is even as a baby, understood the household could only afford enough tears for one. So the little girl was really caretaking of her mother, and that was so painful to hear. And Darlene, this one fascinated me because that's a client, she was a writer. But the thing that caught me was her phone background, to the detail that Kat writes. Her phone background had an image of Hieronymus Bosch's naked woman writing and a unicorn cat without eyeballs. And I was like, okay, I remember that from Garden of Earthly Delights in my art history class, but how did you even think to put that on her phone and why?
I don't remember. I think it's, the details when you're writing them, it's probably like something that I've just been thinking about, or I was like, she's weird, how do I make that obvious,
So
like,
weird,
yeah.
And then I thought the old stranger was an interesting character. There's an older mental stranger who tries to teach or mentor the young guy who is a 5-star stranger. And I found his character fascinating. Was he jaded? Was he bitter? Or was he a vision of like Ghost of Christmas Past? Like this is something that is going to happen to our heroic stranger if he doesn't change his life. Why did you put him in there and what was your thinking about him?
Yeah, so originally he played a much smaller role, just to indicate that, there are other people out there doing this work and that they have been doing it for a long time. But when I submitted this for my thesis, for my MFA, Sam Lipsyte, who was one of my thesis readers, was like, I'm obsessed with this old man. Like, you need more of this old man in the novel. I was like, okay, so I thought about it, and then he ended up playing a much larger role, and I think it is sort of a bit of a warning maybe of if you keep going down this path, this is where you
thought
end
he
up.
was a fascinating character. And this is sort of an unfair question because it's sort of low-hanging fruit and silly, but I love it. Because I looked at the characters and I thought, who would you pick to play these characters in a movie? I was like, that old guy is like Michael Douglas or something. But do you have any thoughts of who, when you visualize your characters, do they resemble anyone?
I'm really bad with celebrities, like I really don't know any, but this question was asked to me at a different event, and people came up to me afterwards and were like, I totally imagine a stranger being Manny Jacinto, I think. He's the guy from The Good Place. Yeah, and I like looked him up and I was like, oh yeah, like very hot, I'm down. Someone else is Simu Liu. Or I've heard, what's his name, Henry Golding.
He's too pretty.
He's too pretty.
So, like, what was the Bruce Lee movie that his daughter, the series that his daughter put out, what was it, Warrior? And what was the lead actor in that? Who's, I think, part Japanese American, right? What's his name?
Andrew Koji.
Yes.
I'll look him up.
Oh my God, and Koji is it. Don't you think? Like for the lead character in this, he's Eurasian. So why did you make the main character Eurasian instead of either just fully Asian or fully not Asian?
There's a whole backstory in an earlier version about him and his father. And so that was sort of like a leftover from that, I think. But also just the idea of him being able to fit in or accentuate one feature or the other, to like go through these spaces at once allowed and yet kind of in the background. I thought it was interesting to have those more, ethnically ambiguous features for him.
So now I'm going to put Kat on the spot, and all of you as well. We're going to play a little parlor game. So this was a game that we played in college, and in law school, and then my niece, like 40 years later, played the game with me last week, and it's kind of resoundingly true still. And so I want you guys to play along. Yeah, you can do it.
Yeah, okay. Do I like write it
Right,
down?
okay, so
cool.
everyone, and you can write notes if you want. The first question is, what is your favorite animal? And 5 adjectives to describe it. You guys doing this? Because it's gonna tell you something about yourself. I'm just gonna burn up a few seconds here, not a long time. Don't think too hard. Do your favorite animal. And 5 adjectives to describe it. If you get 4, that's pretty close. Alrighty? Okay, next is your favorite color. And 5 adjectives to describe it. Next is 5 adjectives to describe water. And the last one is 5 adjectives to describe a white room with no windows or doors. No windows. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what, and strangely, after 40 years of playing this game, every time I did it, my answers were different, but every time in the period of my life I was in, they were strangely true. So the first one is animals, and this is how you see yourself. So Kat, are you courageous enough to read what
Sure,
your
yeah.
animal is? And what
I put cat. I wrote they're independent, funny, nimble, cute, and cuddly.
So I think that's pretty good, right? I mean, if you see yourself today, that's maybe how you see yourself. Just out of curiosity, does anyone in the audience want to shout out something?
Shout out what?
Your animal or your adjective to describe yourself?
Sure. Annoying.
Annoying is what you put as your
And I
adjective?
put dog. Annoying. So that's something.
Okay.
I had hippo and I had 2 of them were powerful and misleading.
Okay, fair enough.
I did,
Yep.
I did sea lion and I put sleepy, loud, and large.
Okay, well, fair enough, because when I was young, I had bear, and it was always foraging for food, sleeping a lot, and willful, which described me at the time. And of late, I say dog, which is sort of like loyal and optimistic and blah, blah, blah. Okay, your favorite color?
I have blue because it's calming, ubiquitous, and cool.
So this is how you want people to see you. Ooh, anybody have guts to talk about how
I
you want?
do want to be cool.
Done. Anybody else have guts to say what color you picked and what, how you want to be perceived? Anyone?
It's an orange, equal, birds, beautiful, bright.
Oh, okay. I would say complicated. Anybody else?
Purple.
What did you do? You did green?
I did green.
And what'd you say?
Healthy, energetic, happy.
Oh, purple?
Purple. It's regal, and it's respected.
Oh, that is so you, Colin. Okay, so the other two, I'm not gonna make you read out loud, because water talks about what you think about sex. And it was teacher, PG rating, right?
That's
So,
funny.
Okay, and then, and look, everybody's laughing, but I'm not gonna make anybody read out loud. And then the white room with no windows and no doors is what you think about that.
That one I can tell.
You know? Okay, so back to your blog.
Yeah.
That
was great. Great
The reason
opening.
why I thought this was funny is because it reminded me of Fantastic. It made me think about what the perfect stranger would say for his animal and his color, and whether that would have changed from the beginning of the book to the end. And the book takes you in a place that you do not expect. The book takes you in a place that is really soulful and emotionally revealing. So I was curious. I had the privilege of talking to another wonderful author earlier this year, and she said that she did not outline. She just sat down and wrote. And I went to another book author event, and the author said that he outlined to the nth degree. And he could tell you from the beginning exactly what each chapter would contain and how it would end. What's your approach?
So I started off just writing it. I didn't have an outline, but then partway through, I had a thesis advisor ask me for an outline of what was going to happen from beginning to end. And so I tried to do that for her, and I sent her what I had, and she looked at it and she was like, "Oh no, like this is not how it's going to end." And I was like, "Oh really?" Because she was going to get like kidnapped at some point. She's like, "No kidnappings." I was like, okay, cool. So I'm really glad I listened to her. And then what I did was I just sort of outlined where I thought it could go, wrote that through, and then I reverse outlined where I like summarize what happens in each chapter. That way I can move pieces around of the story so that they can make sense in the way that I wanted them to. And then I sort of rewrote the entire thing.
So I'm so glad that you didn't do a kidnapping thing.
Yeah.
The ending of this book was really surprisingly emotional for me when I read it. I thought it was poignant, really poignant. So I was curious, because I want to leave some time for audience questions, is to, after book tours and some of your, what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
Yeah, so I'm going to be at a couple of book festivals, a Texas Book Festival and the Brooklyn one. So if anyone is going to any of those, I will be there. Otherwise, yeah, I'm working on my second novel right now. I guess I can give a little bit of a teaser for it. It's about a woman who's in her 30s. She's never traveled abroad, but she's running away from a failed relationship, and so she goes to Japan for the first time ever. A lot of shenanigans. She does not know what is going on in Japan. She accidentally checks into a love hotel instead of a regular hotel, for those of you who know what that is. But then she meets this woman, a Japanese woman, and they become impossibly close, impossibly fast, just really great friends, sort of revealing things to each other that maybe they wouldn't to anyone else. And then this woman goes up north to visit her grandparents, and that's when the 2011 earthquake and tsunami hits. And so the main character has to decide what she's going to do. Is she going to go look for her new friend? Is she going to run away? Is she going to return home to face her problems? You know, and then that's sort of where I am now in that novel.
That is such
A departure from this novel, yeah.
What inspired you to do that?
I actually volunteered after the 2011 tsunami in 2012, and I've always just been interested in like male friendships. So yeah, just a combination of things.
So is there anything that I didn't ask you about today that you wanted to talk about? And what do you want this group or people listening to take away from our conversation and from your book?
Yeah, I guess I just want to talk about the the failed project a little bit, just to show that, like, when I was working on the short story collection, I thought that I would be able to find an agent right away, get an editor, you know, like out the door, and it really didn't work. I spent months trying and nothing happened, and I almost sort of gave up because I thought I was never going to be an author. But while I was freaking out, I also started working on this as a way to sort of cope And so I never would have expected this to be where it is today. But I'm so glad that I, kept going, even though the first project, which I poured my heart and soul into, it feels like a personal rejection when these things don't work out. But you just have to, so for anyone out there who's, thinking about writing or trying to write or anything like that, or not even writing, just whatever it is that you want to do, I would just say, keep going at it. You never know how things are going to turn out.
I'm so glad you told that story because it seems like it happened so fast.
Exactly, yeah.
But some of the other writers that we talked to spent years, like 4 years trying to write a book, 65 rejections or 78 rejections, and yet they kept doing it. So that makes me feel that writers really do have something about them that is a little bit different than maybe the rest of us. So I really, really appreciate that story. And I think we have time, 10 minutes, for a few questions, right? So, Evan, or is someone curating questions here?
You are.
Okay. Would anybody like to ask Kat a question? Yes.
I'm fascinated by your background and also what it meant linguistically. Because if your parents spoke Mandarin and Chinese, and then you learned Japanese, and then you learned English, or you lived in California, and that's even California has its own.
I'm sorry.
I'm
Can
sorry.
you do this so people
You
who are
bet,
listening
yeah.
on air can hear?
So the question is about being, having a multilingual background as well as sort of a multicultural background. Language kind of leaves its own fingerprint. If you're from somewhere, there's a turn of phrase or a catchphrase or a, how did that play in, or does that play into your play with language or your agility, I guess, with language and description?
Yeah, so even in this, because he is from California, the stranger is from California, sometimes he'll let slip things that are, instead of saying waiting online, like you would say in New York, he might say like waiting in line. Just, these little things that he notices because I've noticed them from, being in different places. And I think I like to play with perhaps, or maybe I just never learned properly how certain idioms or phrases or sayings go, because sometimes like my editor will be like, what does this mean? But I'm like, I think it sounds good. Like, why can't we just keep it this way? I can't think of a specific example, but many times she was like, question mark, question mark. And I think that's maybe that like slight disruptive, like me being unfamiliar in some ways with certain aspects of language from a young age that makes me more willing to like play around with it. Yeah,
We have a
thank you.
question in the back.
Hi, Kat.
Hi.
I thought that New York was a big part of this characters of this book, a character in itself. And you just mentioned that you started writing the novel while working on your short stories. So I was curious, was the book always set in New York, or when you moved to New York, did that become the setting and part of the character scope?
Yeah, so actually I wrote a novella-length version of this book back in like 2018. So that was like the original seed of where this book came from. And I think I wrote it around the time I had just moved to New York City. I was pretty lonely, and it just seemed such an interesting place to set this in. One, because there's not that many cities, I think, in the US where you can be totally anonymous, and if you had a job like this, you wouldn't run into the same people. I imagine like in St. Louis, maybe that wouldn't be possible. You'd be like, oh hey, I just went on a date with that guy like last week. And so, for that reason, I thought New York was a good choice. And it's just such a place of, millions of people and yet sort of lonely and isolating. And so it just felt like it was the right setting for this novel.
And how are you here in St. Louis? We are so lucky that you're
So my partner, Jason, was a psych resident at WashU for...
Is he here?
He's here, yeah.
Jason, wait.
So then I came and I worked on, because of him, I was able to come and really have time to work on my writing. So I'm really grateful to Jason and to St. Louis.
Yay, thank you, Jason. We are so lucky to have you here. Did you ever have writer's blocks? And if you did, how did you overcome that?
Yeah, all the time. Well, so I like to have a schedule when I write, like wake up in the morning and then, do the hardest thing I have to do, which to me is writing. So, back when I was in New York, I would literally just like wake up and like pull the laptop onto my lap and write like this. And when I'm writing that way, even if I hit writer's block, I know that I have to spend those hours doing something anyway, so I might as well write, even if I know that it's going to be garbage coming out, like I will still do it, and then maybe one sentence will be worthwhile. I feel like that's the only way for me to get over writer's block, is just to keep going and just know that something will come out of it.
In this book, did you find parts that you really loved writing and parts that you had to power through?
I love writing any family-related scene. Family dynamics are super fun for me to write. Difficult. I was stuck on the end for quite a long time, actually. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with a friend maybe like 3 years ago. He told me something about, I don't want to spoil anything, but he told me something that really sparked the idea for the ending. And once I heard that, I was like, okay, I know how this is going to end.
The end really surprised me.
Yeah.
It was not at all what I expected. So, does anybody have any other questions?
Go back to your second.
Hi, Kat.
Hello.
So, question, your protagonist, obviously, you take us through the story and put us in a series of situations that are dilemmas, and they're, sort of seems to foreground like ethics and how both he processes it and more largely like the book has that kind of overarching. So it was crazy to hear that like literally it was a quarter of the book at some point, because reading it feels so central. So would you mind just like describing a bit about your process and how you evolve that character or sort of move towards that character? Did it have to do with the certain things about larger questions about, the ethics of how he lives, which are tested regularly, and also bigger ethical questions? Was that on your mind a lot? Like how did that?
Sorry, which character are you talking about?
Your protagonist.
Oh, the
Yeah,
protagonist.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the ethics of how you live. That's an interesting question. I didn't think too much, about the ethics. I was focused more on, I met this photographer when I was on a flight once. She's like some Nobel or some like prize-winning photographer. It was crazy. And she was talking about how there's a lot of things that we could learn from photography, writers, the intersection of that. And she was saying, in photography, we think about foreground, midground, and background. And so when I was writing this character, I was always thinking about his dilemmas, like what is front of his mind, what is kind of in the middle, and what is always percolating underneath. And so I think those were more of the things that I had in mind, not that that affected how he responded to situations as he was in them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it really does.
I think the development of him though is what makes that ultimately redeems him.
Oh, yeah.
Because, when I had the same feeling as you. When I first started reading, like, am I even gonna like this guy?
Yeah, oh, you mean like his motivations, I think, become clearer over time, and that, if that's what you're referring to, his motivations, that's something I sort of always knew, so, yeah.
You've alluded to it several times in your remarks, being published is easy. And you had the first short stories which didn't work, this one did. But did you do differently, or did you have luck, or did you find what allowed this book to be sitting in front of us right now?
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier to publish a novel than a short story collection, unfortunately, that's just how the industry works, yeah. I have a lot of, and the MFA sort of gears you towards writing short stories because they're easier to workshop. And so most MFA students at the end of their MFA have a short story collection, which is not really easy to get an agent for versus a novel. So I would love to see MFA programs actually focus more on, helping people who want to write novels, but I'm not entirely sure how to actually go about doing that. So I would say, I think I grew as a writer. The short stories that I wrote helped me experiment and try different things. And so that all, I kind of like plucked things from the short stories and put them in here, so that helped. But I think ultimately, maybe one of the reasons why this got a lot more attention right away is because it's a novel. Just the form itself, like people read more novels than they read short story collections.
But it's also just an intriguing premise.
Yeah, I think that helps.
And the
too.
fact that it didn't turn into sort of a silly rom-com with like Deborah Messing or something playing the lead and having a date for her wedding, made this really resonant. Okay. Oh, we have one more.
One more.
Hi, Kat.
Hello.
I was curious about what inspired you to create Stranger's mom's character, because she's not a typical Asian American mom that devotes her life, to the child. She prioritizes her career over the well-being of her child. So I was just wondering what inspired you to create the character and the dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah, I think she came from this like concern of mine about whether or not I want to have children, because I was like, well, I have these ambitions, I have these things I want to accomplish. I don't know, is that like, how would that affect maybe a child? So originally she and Stranger were both narrators, kind of going back and forth. And it would have been her when she was younger before she had him. And so she was always a very important character, and she still is. She's just not in the foreground as much, but she definitely shows up throughout. So yeah, that's a great question, because I think that's where it came from, is this sort of worry in my own mind about, how does one be a good mother, but and also be ambitious and all these things. Like, what if you're not? What does it mean to be a bad mother, honestly, Yeah.
Yeah, I think you will find the book, if you haven't read it, remarkably beguiling. It brings you in another unexpected way. When I started reading it, I thought, I'm not sure if I like this guy, I'm not sure if I like the story, the premise, because you want to really like the protagonist when you're reading, right? And I ultimately did really like him. And I think one of the things that really redeemed him for me was his relationship with Lori. And now the blowers have come on, so I think that signals we're at an end. I want to thank you so much for spending time with us and for your wonderful book, and we look forward to reading your future books as well. We look forward to the movie of this. And that's all. Give her a great vacation.
Thanks everybody for coming. We have books at the counter. We had a little autographing for you, if you would like. So thanks so much.
Thank you for coming.